Hey, you can be seated. Great to have you with us this morning. If you don't know who I am, I'm Pastor John. I'm one of the associate pastors here at the church, and it's my delight to share with you God's Word this morning. And today we're in our series in the book of Genesis, which is, of course, the first book of the Bible. And so we are in this theme of back to the beginning. And we're near the end of the book of Genesis, and we're going to talk today about the story of Joseph. Now, the story of Joseph is a rather large story. It would take me too long to preach this in one message, so I got good news for you. This is the first of a two-parter, but winding up for me next week will be the very capable and awesome Jerry Lougheed. He gets the fun part, truthfully. I get the first part, he gets part two. So Jerry, you're going to do that for us next week, and I'm excited to hear what God has on Jerry's heart. And I believe we're excited to hear what God has on our hearts today too, and what we can learn from this. So did anybody get the homework this week in the e-newsletter? Did you read Genesis chapters 37 and chapters 39? I know some of you did, because some of you have talked to me this week and said, oh, yep, I read it, I'm ready to go. So there was a lot of reading, and I knew if I spent time reading through both of those chapters today, I wouldn't have really much to tell you about them, other than we'd read them together. So this is a really good idea. And for those of you that didn't, if the story of Joseph is unfamiliar to you, I'm going to try and give you as brief of a synopsis as I can here in the next few minutes. Now, Joseph came from what I would kind of describe as a bit of a messed up family background, all right? His father, Jacob, actually had gotten married twice. He actually worked for a man named Laban, and he agreed to work for 7 years so he could marry this beautiful girl named Rachel, who he loved, and he just absolutely adored Rachel. So he works for 7 years for Laban, and then on the wedding day, he's finished all of this work. He's labored hard in the guy's fields. On the wedding day, they veil the bride, and he gets Rachel's older sister, who wasn't quite as attractive, and he finds this out when it's too late, and he's already made his promises. He gets Leah. And then so the twisted Laban comes to him and says, well, if you work another 7 years, then you'll get the girl you really wanted in the first place. So 14 years of his life. Jerry talked about that in a sermon a few weeks ago about Rachel and Leah. So that's kind of the background of this story. Now, Jacob has 12 children. These would be later known as really representatives or the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel down the line. So with Leah, his original wife, whom, let's face it wasn't his first choice and didn't really want to marry, that's not what his intention was, he had 10 children. And then when he finally gets the girl of his dreams, they have 2 children. She dies giving birth to the second one. His name is Benjamin. He's the youngest. But the oldest child that they had, who was really his 11th in line, is Joseph. So Jacob has created a bit of a problem in this sense. He actually showed favoritism to Joseph over his other sons, which you never as a parent do, right? You can't show favoritism, right? There should be no favorites, but that messes things up in a family dynamic. It certainly does. And so that was exactly what happened here. It messed up some of the relationship between Jacob and his older siblings, and the favoritism in Joseph that Jacob had, even like his mom was gone, his mom passed away, but Jacob just adorned this kid. He made him this wonderful coat with all kinds of colors on it. That's what the Bible describes it as. And young Joseph, at about 17 years old, starts having these dreams. And one of the dreams he has is that there are 11 sheaves of wheat standing up. And there's one sheaf of wheat in the middle, which he says, well, that's me. And the 11 represented all of his other siblings, and those sheaves of wheat would bow down before him. Now, if you're one of these older brothers, all right, and you kind of know a little bit about the family dynamic, you're going to say, that 17-year-old punk's a real jerk, right? Absolutely, that's what you're going to say. You're like, that arrogant little whatever, right? How dare he come up with this idea that we're going to bow to him? I mean, come on. So that is one of the things that happens. And eventually over time, he shares some other dreams with his brothers. And you can sense that there's some arrogance, and they're really understanding this, and they're really getting this feed off of Joseph. And they're like, oh, we're going to fix him, right? You ever been like that? We're going to fix them, right? And so these guys, the older brothers, decide they're going to get him. So they find this cistern, which is a dried up well that would collect water in rainy times and be used for drinking water. They found a dried up cistern and they threw him in there and put a stone over top of it. So he winds up in this pit or well, if you will. And then the boys take the coat off him and they say, oh yeah, let's do this. Let's dip this thing in some goat's blood and we'll take it to Dad and then we'll tell Dad that he's been killed. We'll tell Dad that he's absolutely gone, to try to restore this somewhat of justice in the family and get rid of this favoritism. They were at the point they were ready to kill him. Now, the oldest brother, Reuben, stops them and tries to stop them, and he basically kind of runs out and goes after the other guys, and he's going to rescue Joseph from the pit and go, okay, look, I'm going to take him back to Dad. Maybe this is enough. We've humbled him. We've buried him in there for a while. Maybe this will settle him down. Before Reuben, the oldest brother, gets back with the other brothers, he finds out that the other brothers sold Joseph into a bunch of Midianites who were in a caravan heading towards Egypt. They sold him for a bunch of shekels of silver. And so, therefore, he was still alive, but they sold him into slavery. And then, now the problem is, what are we going to tell Dad? So that's what they did. They dipped his coat in blood. They basically took it back to Dad and said, well, look, he's a goner. There's nothing we could have done. We didn't know it. We just found the coat. So they lied through their teeth about it. And there went Joseph. Now, Joseph's story doesn't stop there. It continues in through getting into working for a man in his household. And then eventually he winds up in prison. So we're going to pick up the story there a little bit later on. How many of you have ever been 17 years old? What was your dream like at 17 years old? I'll tell you what my dream was at 17 years old. I played in a rock band with a bunch of Christian friends and in my church community, and I wanted to be a rock and roll star. Okay, that's really what I wanted to be. And I had this plan, and oh man, we went and we had a chance to play at this Christian music festival in upstate New York at this talent showcase. We had sent in an audition tape. Remember tapes, cassettes? Had to send in an audition cassette, and we got chosen in the top 6. We went and played and competed, got second place, if you can believe this. Had a great time, and got to meet some of the stars of Christian music of the day who we were big fans of. And then we got talking to this guy that was a record producer, and oh boy, stuff could happen. I was sold. That's it, man. Try to get through to grade 12. We're going to go on the road. We're going to be famous. We're going to do all these wonderful things. Now, I can remember my mom and dad, and they're rolling their eyes right now because they're sitting over here in this row because they will remember this story very well, but asking me questions like, what's the backup plan here? Like, come on, what's realistic? Because, let's face it, even back in the day, how is this even going to work, right? And, that started to get me to ask some serious questions of myself. What is the backup plan? What's the plan for my life? Is my dream even possible? Is my dream even appropriate? And so that actually, over time, not only because of my parents, but because of some other great influences in my life, they were praying for me. My grandmother prayed for me an awful lot. That finally drove me to my knees and asked God, what would you have for me? What do you want me to do with my life? I had this grandiose plan that I'm going to go on the road, going to be famous. It's going to be the most awesome thing in the world. But God actually spoke to me. Now, when I pray, I don't know how many of you have ever heard what you feel is an audible voice. And that doesn't happen for me often. Usually I get an impression, a word of scripture, or just a word in my heart that is the sense that God, or direction that God wants me to go, or something, or a task that God wants me to do. But I heard a voice, and that voice said, you are called to pastoral ministry. Did not want to do this at 17 years old. Didn't think that was such a hot idea. And because I thought to myself, oh my goodness, what do I know about all my people that are friends of mine that are in the ministry? They're making zero money, they're broke all the time, and they're working harder than most other people. A 40-hour work week could turn into 80, and I'm like, I didn't want any part of it. I wanted to be famous. I wanted to go on the road. That was going to be my life. But God stirred my heart over that from time to time over the coming weeks and the coming months to the point where I knew I couldn't deny it. I knew that I had to make a change. I knew I had to go back because we had a thing called grade 13 then. Any of you remember that? The only place in the world that pretty much had it, but we had it. So, and if you wanted to go to college or university, post-secondary education, have any of it, you had to go and get your grade 13. So I stayed back and my fellow bandmates continued on. And here's where I got really upset with God over this story. Because it turned out the record producer we had talked to, we had signed some sort of document that said, oh, we'll go down to New York State and make a 3-album cut, a demo, see what happens, right? And the guy turned out to be a phony and a shyster. Now, I missed this part of it because the guy that replaced me in the band actually had way more talent at the instrument that he was playing than I ever did or ever, I shouldn't have even been up there in a lot of ways. See, I was settling. I was just a background bass player. That's all I was. But I wanted to be a rock and roll star. That's what we wanted to do. So anyways, the guy that replaced me, better at the job than I was, more appropriate, better sound, all of those things. And then where I got kind of upset was when they called me one day and they said, you'll never guess what happened. We got signed with Word Records, which was the biggest Christian label at the time. So they got signed. They were going on. It was like 7 years, 7 albums or 7 years. It was something absolutely ridiculous. And then I'm like, God, this is what I wanted. How come I didn't get this opportunity? So I began to get very upset over that. And you know what ended up happening? Not 3 months later, my friends were all packing up their lives, getting ready to move to Nashville, Tennessee, get ready to do their first recording project, get in the studio quick, lay an album down, go out on tour, opening for other bigger bands. They got a phone call one day from the guy they signed the contract with at Word Records saying that the contract was suddenly canceled. The night before, a little thing called iTunes launched. It changed the music industry from the small to the huge. 5 major record labels across the world, like Sony, BMI, and major labels, bought up every medium and small record company they could to own all the rights to as much music as they could because they were afraid they were going to lose money. Dead was going to be the idea and the concept of an 11-track CD because you could buy one song or a hit song for 99 cents. The industry didn't know how to handle it. So suddenly all the contracts that hadn't been started or started to be fulfilled were canceled. So I felt horrible for my friends at the same time, but I thought I was missing out. But it ended up being that didn't work out exactly the way that the plan happened. And today I'm going to take an angle from the story today. And I'm going to talk to you about the story of Joseph from an angle that normally isn't talked about. I remember talking about this and learning about it in Sunday school. And we got so focused on how evil these brothers must have been. They sold them into slavery, and then they kind of got their just desserts later. And I'm not going to steal Jerry's thunder from the sermon he's going to preach on Sunday. They got their just desserts later because they would eventually bow down to him. But I'm going to take an angle from this story that some of the things in Joseph's life that were hard, that were difficult, that he didn't, and maybe it was unfair that he went through them, that they had to happen, all right? That God actually allowed some of those things to happen to him in order to prepare him, okay? Now, playing in the band that I played in for a long time, it prepared me to a degree, but here's the thing. The vision that I had for my life and the vision God had for me in my life was so much better. But the problem is I couldn't see it in the moment. See, I never saw myself as any form of leader. I never saw myself with a voice. I didn't sing and play at the same time. I couldn't do it. Hard to believe the person you know me to be in the last bunch of years. See, God had a bigger plan. And God had a bigger plan for Joseph, even through some tough moments. So Joseph winds up, of course, in slavery, as you know, and as we talked about. Ends up working for this guy named Potiphar. And Potiphar he's a government official, works for the Pharaoh of Egypt. And he's very prominent, has a lot of leadership. So he brings Joseph into his house, and over time, Joseph grows in stature. Joseph starts working, and Joseph does a great job with what he does. Pretty soon, Joseph is running the entire house. In slavery, yes, but then getting some free reign and developing his leadership skills and leadership ability. So why did Joseph have to go through all this? The first thing I want you to know, too, is that God had to humble that young man. Let me tell you, at 17 years old, and I'm proof of this, 17 years old, you're not ready for the yoke of leadership or the yoke of call that God has on your life. God can put a call on your life, and God does put a call on your life, but at 17, your arrogance isn't worked out yet. Your skill set isn't developed yet. You're not mature yet, so you have to go through a process. And so that first part of the process was humbling Joseph. And that was a very important part of the story. We talk about the 17-year-old with the dream and the vision of himself. Now, this vision wasn't a false vision, but how it was portrayed, how it was talked about, was done in a way that was filled with pride. And it came across as absolute arrogance. It drove his brothers to really want to take his life when you think about it. So that's part of the problem. God had to refine Joseph through humility. And God does his best work through us through humility. You see, true humility understands that God is 100% responsible for every blessing, for every success, for every outcome, and for every reward. That's giving it to God, knowing that, this was not done of myself. And that's giving it to God 100%. James reminds us that God even opposes the proud, but he gives that grace to the humble. I'm going to read to you a passage in Deuteronomy, which is 6 or 7 generations past Joseph, when Israel was enslaved as a nation to Egypt much later on. But then God allowed them to exit that form of slavery, and then they wandered in the desert for 40 years, and God had to teach them over those 40 years to hear his voice. Deuteronomy verse 8 and 23, after this 40 years, on the cusp of entering the promised land that God had for them, these words, remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years to humble and test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commands. He humbled you, causing you to hunger and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your ancestors had known, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. So we are humbled sometimes to learn how to hear the voice of God, to learn how to trust God. And it's hard when you're going through a difficult time to trust God, because an awful lot of times, and I imagine Joseph had moments like this too, he might have thought that God abandoned him. What am I doing? He's had this vision cast on him that he's going to be in some role of leadership, and yet he is enslaved. It would be very easy to get angry with God, and some of us do when we look at our circumstances, because we don't understand that God is allowing us to go through a process that's going to go and make a difference, that's going to go and change our lives and the lives of those around us. The second thing God had to do was refine Joseph. That's how we get to know his voice. It's in the heat of some of those moments. It is in the process of refining. Now, where do we live? What's this town called? Sudbury. What's Sudbury known for? The mines. Nickel, copper, all these things. You don't just go and blast a hole in the ground and find pure nickel. You don't find pure copper or pure metals. You don't, right? What has to happen? It's got to get refined. You got to take ore out of the ground. That's got to get burnt down, melted down to separate the pure mineral away from all of that stuff. And then dumping the slag, the leftovers, and separating that. See, this is exactly what has to happen to us in our lives. We go through a process of refinement. And refinement burns off some of the impurities in us. We are full of impurities, right? But when God can get us to that point where he's burned off those impurities and he's preparing us over time so that we can not only shine like the precious metals that are out there, we can be used to our fullest potential. God takes us down and gets us ready to be used for his glory and for his wonderful work. God had to do that process in the life of Joseph. He had to refine him and had to burn away some of those things, burn away that pride, as we talked about earlier today. And it's in moments like this that we find out just how real God is. It's in some of our greatest difficulties, and it's in the testing of us. God gave a word to the nation of Israel many, many years later through the prophet Isaiah in chapter 48. And he writes these words, "See, I have refined you, though not as silver, but I have tested you in the furnace of affliction." If you're going through something today and you feel challenged and you feel like your back's up against the wall, you feel depressed, you feel totally depleted, know today that somehow you are learning something through the process of refinement. God is refining you and getting you ready for something greater. I believe that 150%. The third thing, besides refinement, and besides humility, was that God was really preparing Joseph for what he had in store for him. The vision and the dream that he had was true. The vision was a good vision. And one day others eventually would bow down to him. But he needed to be prepared for the role of leadership. And that's why we talk about the importance of that story. When he is in captive, when he is enslaved to the man Potiphar, he worked his way up over time as a servant. Probably started in the kitchen. You never know where he started, but it ended up he was running the entirety of the household. Potiphar didn't have to worry about anything in his house because Joseph ran it more efficiently than he could as the man he was. But, the story gets a little tougher. Potiphar's not even paying attention to the duties of the household over time, and suddenly Potiphar's wife gets jealous. She gets massively jealous because he's not around anymore. He's focusing totally on his work and this and that. The house is running great. Sure, all of the responsibilities are being cared for. But Potiphar's wife starts getting jealous. And she sees the guy that's really doing the work in the house is this servant Joseph, who's been raised up, from someone a bit younger and growing a bit in wisdom and stature, running the whole show. And so therefore she winds up jealous. And she's trying to get the attention of her husband. And, I'm going to fix him. So suddenly more problems become in store for Joseph. He's gone from the pit to working for Potiphar. And then the wife of Potiphar is jealous and upset with him. I have to fix this. I need the attention of my husband again. So how she decided to do it was she said, she was trying to tempt Joseph into sleeping with her and trying to get him involved in a romantic relationship and that kind of thing. And Joseph, in his wisdom, absolutely refused this temptation that was being brought before him. And it's important for us to remember that when we are in some of our difficult moments in life, we will be tempted. So it's important for us to stand firm on what we know, even in the hardest times. And Joseph did that and passed that test very well. And then she tried again and again, and finally she chased after him, grabbed him by the cloak, tried to get him into bed, didn't work. He ran off, and a piece of cloak was left behind as he ran away. And then she goes to her husband and says, he slept with me. Look what he did. He defiled you as a leader. And so then Joseph winds up in prison. Goes from bad to worse. Isn't this great? Aren't you just feeling encouraged and excited about this? It goes from bad to worse. Guy winds up in prison for 13 years. So it winds up that God isn't quite done refining Joseph just yet and getting him ready. So he winds up in prison. But I love the end of chapter 39 if you've read it. The thing that I love about that was very similar to what happened in Potiphar's house when he was working for this man Potiphar. He grew. He grew in wisdom, he grew in stature, and he grew with leadership roles. And over his time in prison, and it'd be very easy if you're locked up in chains all the time to just kind of give up and think, well, God, you've got nothing for me. And it would be easy to give up and absolutely do nothing, right? Just kind of waste away. And it'd be an automatic choice for some of us in some ways. The easiest thing to do. But no. Winds up that the jailer, the head jail guard of the entire prison, starts liking this kid. Starts realizing he has potential. And then next thing you know, he's running the jail. He's like the head prisoner. He's running the whole jail. Then the jail guard doesn't have to worry about his life. Certainly starts getting better because this kid winds up in this situation. And I'm not going to go any deeper into the story because Jerry's going to pick it up for you next week. But it doesn't stop in prison. What he learns in prison, the dreams that he continues to have, and then the dreams he would interpret not only for the jailer but for Pharaoh later on would go and take him out of that situation and get him ready for that leadership and really be the resolution to that vision, the physical manifestation of it. There's a few things I want you to remember today as you think about this story, because this story is powerful. And it's a reminder for us that no matter what you're going through today, God's with us. God is allowing us sometimes to experience things that we don't like, and we think that God is farthest away from us. But the first thing I want you to take home with you today and remember about this story today, no matter who you are, no matter what you're going through today, first thing is don't be discouraged. Please do not be discouraged. It's the easiest thing to feel We have a world that suffers with it through depression and different things. When we allow discouragement to take over, these things take root. And when those things take root, they produce bad fruit. When you produce bad fruit, then you wind up dying off piece at a time. I've seen it before. But don't be discouraged. Isaiah had this command to Israel as well. But you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, you who are descendants of Abraham, God's friend, I took you from the ends of the earth, from its farthest corners I called you. I said, you are my servant. I have chosen you and not rejected you. You know that God's chosen each and every one of you today? He's not rejected you. He has chosen you. And that's when the line comes. So don't fear. Don't be afraid. For I am with you. Don't be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you, and I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. And these are some words of Jesus much later on that really have an impact. And I do not like this line. I never have. But I'm going to read this to you because it's important, because we all share this in common. He says, in this world, you will have what? Trouble. It's going to be trouble. In other words, this existence is not going to be perfect. You're not just going to scale on and, you're born into automatic perfection and everything's going to work out for you perfectly. It doesn't work like that for any of us. Jesus reminds us, in this world you're going to have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world. So when we have the strength of Christ behind us, when we trust in that strength, and when we put Him first in our lives, we begin to realize that the struggles that we face, the trials that we are going through, are only temporary. That God still has a vision for each and every one of us, and a plan, I know in my case, that was bigger than I could imagine. Much bigger, and has full of potential, way more potential than I ever thought possible. So don't be discouraged today, friends. God is with us. Second thing is, don't give up on your dream. Some of you came here and you still got a dream maybe from way back, or you have a vision. You think you have a plan that God may have for your life, and God is working out that plan in very many ways. And sometimes we arrive at some different things. Like, I thought I was going to be a rock and roll musician. That's what I wanted to be, and that sort of thing. But in very many ways, I've been able to see some of that in my life playing in church over the years. God called me to a leadership role, which I never saw the potential of that in myself, but God worked it out differently. I couldn't sing and play at the same time. That was like two sides of the brain fighting. That changed because I honed skill over time. But God developed some maturity in me, and I let Him lead. And I trusted Him and put a shaky foot forward at times. And you know what? God has done so much in me, I can't tell you who I used to be. I would have been afraid to do this. I would have been afraid to stand before you and say a word. It would have been it would have been too difficult. It would have felt too phony, But I do know that God has a plan and a vision for each and every one of you, and you can't give up on that dream. How that dream manifests itself, how it works itself out, or the process it's working itself out to be and through, may not be exactly what you see in the moment. And you may think that's the furthest thing that's away. And you may think that you're going through the hardest time of your life right now, but you must endure this time. And one of the things you can do is choose to do what Joseph did. In spite of being in slavery, in spite of being in prison, he still put his best foot forward. He still worked hard. He still put his effort forward. And that effort was rewarded because he wound up running everything over time, right? So our effort is 1,000% important. My dad used to quote this to me all the time. Whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, do it with all thy might. And that is not only true in the good times and in maybe the career or job you have or what you love to do. That's true in the difficult times. Make sure that you're putting your best foot and your best effort forward. So don't give up on your dream. And the third and most important thing, I think, is don't settle for mediocre. All right? I think a lot of us can say we have settled for mediocre in our lives. And I've heard it said this way, don't let good enough be good enough, right? I think that's important for us to remember. Be great at what you do. Don't ever settle for mediocrity, or else you'll always wonder how great you could have been, right? So there's some practical things that we can do. Serve wholeheartedly, Paul says in Ephesians, as if you were serving the Lord, not people, because you know that the Lord will reward each and every one for whatever good they do, whether they are slave or free. So no matter where you find yourself today, Make sure that you're serving God with your best. You're giving him your best in spite of your circumstances. You're trusting him knowing that the outcome is bigger than you can see today. And know that God has your best in mind. God has your best in his heart and in his plan. The thing is, we got to surrender to that plan. Some people don't see the full potential in their life because they don't surrender to the plan. So surrender to God's plan. It's better than even the dream you may have in the physical, and it'll be amazing what God can do through each and every one of us. Just imagine, how could tomorrow look so much different or better for you than today could? Tomorrow's got all kinds of potential. I'm going to call the band back up here, and we're going to get ready for a time of communion here in a few moments. What could it look like if you and I responded to our current challenges, the things that we face, and we've responded to those things differently? If we still put a smile on our face even when things were hard, if we still worked with full diligence and full effort even though things seemed impossible. You know, I look around this room today and I wonder not only about the gifted minds and the gifted people that we have in this room, but I wonder about the potential that is in this room that's yet to happen, that we're yet to see. I'm going to tell you, at midlife, which I'm at now, I haven't arrived yet. I haven't arrived at the full potential that God has for me. I know there's more, and I know there's more for each and every one of you. No matter if you're 2 years old or 102 years old, which I know somebody here almost is. You know, God is still using us, and God is still working his plan through us to go and make a difference in the lives of others, to bless others with his assurance and with his love, because his direction and his plan is better than what we have for ourselves. God's potential and God's plan for me was better than I set up for myself and more than I could have ever expected or imagined. I'm going to read to you this scripture today from 1 Peter. I love this. It says, friends, when life gets really difficult, how many of you have some difficulty in your life? Come on, be honest. Friends, when life gets really difficult, don't jump to the conclusion that God isn't on the job. Instead, be glad that you are in the very thick of what Christ experienced himself. This is a spiritual refining process with glory just around the corner. In other words, you're not meant to stay in the pit, friends. You're not meant to stay enslaved or entangled in whatever it is you're going through today. God has more. He's got glory around the corner. He's got a better plan. So let's surrender ourselves to that plan today. Dave's going to play a great song for you this morning as we get ready for communion. And if you don't have your communion cup, you can go to the back two tables over on this side and this side here and get yourselves, and let's prepare our hearts to receive and share in the Lord's Supper together.